Hey, howdy, hey, and welcome to Regenerative Farming News, a podcast where we talk about all things related to regenerative farming in Western Canada. Friend, I am so glad you're tuning in and spending this time with me. I just love talking about regenerative farming and how these principles can help farmers make more money, live better lives, and enjoy farming with less stress. If all of that sounds too good to be true, then you'd better stick around and listen to my guest this week. Bluesette Campbell is one of the owners and managers of a 4,000-acre, 700-head cow-calf operation in northern Saskatchewan. Originally from the USA, Bluesette shares how, at 22 years old, she was managing a ranch where she met her future husband and discovered that ranching didn't have to be such a struggle. All it takes is a mindset shift. If you like regenerative farming, please hit that follow button and share this show with your friends. You can also follow the show on Facebook and Instagram. I saw something funny this week in a store. There was a keychain with the saying, "You don't have to drive me crazy. I'm close enough I can walk." Let's get out our shovels so we can dig in to this week's episode. Well, harvest is pretty well complete across the Canadian prairies. Driving by all of those empty fields, I hope that one day I'll see fall cover crops over most of them, as farmers discover the power of having a living root in the soil all season long. Those roots and plants collecting the moisture and saving it for the next spring, all the while feeding the microbial activity in the soil. There are a few fields that are planted to fall rye here and there, but I imagine a day maybe 10 or 15 years from now, when most of them are still green and growing right up to snow cover or hard frost, and crops like fall rye coming back again first thing in springtime. I see photos and videos of farmers in the States seeding right into their lush green cover crops. I believe they do spray the cover crop to make sure it dies or is terminated, so that the seeds that they are planting into it can grow up from under the layer of dead cover crop material. One farmer posted in a cover crop group on Facebook about this new technique, and he called it planting green. I've heard it also labeled as green manure as well. Now, this farmer is in Kansas, so there's a much longer season down there, but I'll try to find some farmers in Canada who are doing this for future episodes. This farmer in Kansas, however, did see some incredible improvements in his weeds and lowered input costs. He said that he sprayed the green manure field twice, one time to kill the rye cover crop, and once a month later for pigweeds. Here's where it gets interesting. He had another field a quarter-mile away with no rye cover crop, and he sprayed that field 4 times and still had weed issues. He said that his weed control on the cover-cropped field was so great that he, quote, couldn't be happier. That sounds like a pretty happy farmer to me, and that sounds a heck of a lot less stressful than spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on equipment and sprays trying to control the weeds. One weed in particular that he mentioned was Palmer amaranth, which is a new weed that has been noticed in Manitoba coming up from the States where it's more of a problem. It's tactics like this green manure or planting green that I believe could solve the kochia weed problem we are already struggling with in Canada, and could help stop the new weeds coming up from the States. The sprays are already not working, and the weeds are getting more resistant every year. So we've got to find something, and I'm positive this is it. I do not know how possible it is to do the green manure or planting green in Canada, with our season being so much shorter. But if other farmers are able to grow a crop up through that kind of thick layer of mulch, then I believe it's possible here too. Am I wrong? If farmers in the States are seeding into cover crops, I don't see why it couldn't work up here. Let me know what you think in the comments on Facebook or Instagram. I know it sounds crazy that I'm saying we could be farming with more plants and growing more crops with the same amount of rainfall. I know that conventional farming wisdom says leave the soil bare and conserve the water usage. But that's just not true. That's not how we keep the water. And it's only a matter of time until more and more farmers realize this. Covering the soil and growing as many roots as possible will unlock a whole new level of profitability and joy in farming in Canada. Now I'm so excited to watch it unfold. Am I crazy? Look up regenerative farming news on our social media and let me know. There is a weekend event I'll be covering later this month, a personal leadership course hosted by Holistic Management Canada near Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. That event is fully booked as I was able to get the last spot, but I am excited to share with you some of the information and insights from the event as it relates to holistic and regenerative farming. The event is being organized by Bluesette Campbell, president of Holistic Management Canada, whom I had the pleasure of interviewing this week. It was so great to sit down with Bluesette and talk about how she found regenerative and holistic practices and the incredible difference they've made in her life and her family's lives. Hello, Bluesette. I am so excited to have you on the podcast today to share your knowledge and experience and your story. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about who you are and how you got to this point?
Well, thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Bluesette Campbell. I live kind of in the northwest region of Saskatchewan on a third generation ranch. So it's my husband's family. The Campbells have been here since 1948. And my husband and I were married in the States, which is where I'm originally from. And we moved here in 2002. We met on a ranch that managed cattle and sheep and managed holistically. And that was sort of my first introduction into this whole idea of designing and practicing uh, agriculture in a way that was profitable and meaningful for the people and not just the drudgery of, producing beef or lamb or grain or whatever the conventional way. And so once we were married and had an invitation to come back to his family operation here near Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, we've been practicing holistically since then. And this ranch has been managed here holistically since the late 80s. So my husband's father, Don Campbell, began some of these practices long before when they were envelope pushing practices way back in the late 80s. We raise cattle here. We have about a 4,000 acre ranch. We have approximately 700 cow calf pairs. We sometimes background our calves and might put them in the feedlot over the winter, depending on feed sources here. But then we grass them. So we have stockers and we sell our calves at about 18 months of age. And that is proving to be very profitable these days. If you notice, the cattle market has been very excited as of late. So we ranch here with our family. My husband's brother is here on the ranch. And so we partnered together. We've had a successional plan in place basically since we came here in 2002. And we're just about getting ready to transfer potentially to the next generation. So, once you finish one transition, you're starting into another. My husband's parents still live here on the ranch and they are fully retired and, want to carry out their days here on the ranch, and we'll support that as much as possible. So right now, our 4,000 acre ranch supports 3 families. And one of those families is fully retired, so they're not contributing in terms of physical labor anymore, but the ranch still supports them financially. So, we have to be very mindful of our profitability so that everyone can live their best life here. I would just also say that I grew up on a sheep ranch in Montana but really did not see myself fitting into agriculture the way we practiced agriculture. And when you're a kid, you sort of think that that's the way things happen, right? That's your only experience. And so until you kind of grow up and mature as an adolescent, begin to see things around you a little bit differently, I just assumed that was farming and ranching.
Mm.
And it wasn't until later that I realized that there are many different ways that you can live in agriculture. So that's sort of where I'm coming from and how it sort of shaped, what I'm currently doing today.
Okay, so yeah, I was just going to ask you. So you said that where you grew up on the sheep farm, it was managed holistically. So you've kind of grown up in that experience then, whereas other people didn't grow up with that and are transitioning to it. Is that right?
No, so I grew up in a conventional setting.
Oh,
Actually, we were
conventional.
first
Okay.
first generation. My mom was born and raised mostly in New York. So not in the city, but upstate New York, and moved around quite a bit. It was her that wanted to, learn how to, grow her own food and, raise my sister and I on that place. And so we grew up without that knowledge, without much
Mm.
knowledge actually about agriculture. But I met my husband, or soon to be husband, on a ranch that I started managing when I was around 22. And his experience was entirely different. I was coming to the table with it's a slog, it's not profitable, you have to work, dawn till dusk, 365 days of the year. It rarely works out and it's very stressful. To this idea of like, well, actually, who's driving the bus, who's in charge of your schedule, who decides, what you're doing on the ranch. And so that was the first time at the age of 22 that I began to sort of see that agriculture could be something quite different than what I had experienced.
Oh, I see. Yes, so you have made a very big transition then. That sounds like a night and day difference. Um,
Yes, big difference.
yeah, that's exciting. So you met him and you started saying, "Wow, this sounds like a really great thing," and you started learning about it. Can you remember, like, maybe the first things you started implementing that made a big difference for you, and what were the changes you made?
Yeah, so the prerequisite for the job that I took managing a sheep and cattle ranch in Montana was that I take a holistic management course. So it was brand new to me. I had no idea what it was, but I took a course with a certified educator, Roland Cruz, in Blackfoot, Idaho, actually. So they shipped me off to a different state and I began to learn. And I remember the first thing I learned was around profitability. Um, at in my childhood, because there was my mom and my sister and I became the bookkeeper and
Mm,
I started writing out checks. I remember I was 9 years old and my mom, taught me how to write out a check. She said, here's the number, here's the thing, this is how you do it. I will sign all the checks later. And, first I thought that was very cool. And then as by the time I was around 12, I realized the weight of that.
mm,
And when I realized that, the math was not adding up and there was a lot of negative numbers, and, I began to feel responsible
mm,
for our well-being. And so, when I came to the holistic management course at 22, and Roland Cruz said to me, well, actually, you get to decide whether your operation is profitable or not. And that totally shifted the way I was thinking about it. And, I really challenged him. Well, what do you mean? We have no control over markets. How do you? And so he began to describe to me like that choice and control over how you design your enterprises, how you can stack enterprises, and but you really need to know what it is that you want. And so that was the original shift for me. My husband and I actually lived in Bozeman, Montana for a couple of years, and we were not in agriculture, but we spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how we were going to carve our way into agriculture and, find a ranch. Or, Montana land prices were astronomical even back then. And then we got an invitation to be a part of Mark's family ranch. So we, grabbed that. What I didn't know when I said yes to Mark's proposal was that his father-in-law would become my future mentor, that, Don Campbell is considered kind of the grandfather of holistic management here in Canada, and that I would be immersed in it from here on out. And so that's sort of, the backstory of why I'm so involved in it currently.
Oh, that's a beautiful story.
Yeah,
Like
well, it's been super fun. It's been a ride.
recently about what is the difference between holistic management and the regenerative practices. I was just saying on my last podcast that the regenerative practices actually kind of fit underneath or into the idea of holistic management. Can you just give the listeners a breakdown of how that works?
Yeah, I guess in my personal opinion, I think that there's been a subset of people in agriculture who have questioned our conventional practices for quite some time. So when you think about conventional farming, using tillage, using sprays or industrial fertilizers and things like that, but there have been a few naysayers all along. There were probably quite a few in the 60s and 70s saying this doesn't seem right. This is not necessarily a new concept. And in fact, the principles of holistic management as developed by Alan Savory are really about how are we going to sustain this century after century. So, he was a big proponent of saying, do you see the globe? If you look at the deserts, they are not shrinking, they're expanding. Perhaps we have a bit more to do with that than, what we're considering. And so, he began his work on creating the brittleness scale, and how to use tools differently in different areas, different ecoregions, and over time developed the practices and principles of holistic management. And that is largely based on effective decision making. So it doesn't matter whether you're in agriculture or not. It's about making decisions towards something that you desire. So what you value. Now, regenerative agriculture is specifically about how do we sustain food production? How do we work the land in a way that actually improves it while we're using it as opposed to depleting it? So you could see that regenerative practice easily fits into this effective decision-making framework of holistic management. But to me, it's quite separate because regenerative practice in farming is only one thing, one subset of what people living on the land can do or people living on Earth can do. So if you're living in New York City, you may not consider being a part of regenerative agriculture, but you can drive with your consumer power. You can drive how things are being produced when you get enough people that say, hey, I really would like whatever I'm fueling my body with to be, produced in a regenerative way. So that's kind of one silo, although it's not a linear process. That is one part of it. But holistic management is, yes, about producing quality food, yes, to improving soil health and, reducing inputs, and it's about profitability. But primarily, it's about people need to identify and figure out what it is that they value so that decisions that they make, regardless of whether they're in agriculture or not, decisions that they make lead towards what they want. And I would say pervasively, we have people out there making decisions that have nothing to do with what they want. And therefore, we're finding a lot of people who experience, malcontent. They're not happy with their lives. They're kind of on a treadmill and doing what they think they should do, not doing what they really desire to do.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. I love that. I just wanted to go back to something you had mentioned, and that was that you have three families all making full-time incomes or retired incomes as well, but still three incomes off of 4,000 acres. Um, Now maybe this is just my perspective, so I don't know, correct me if this is wrong, but that seems like a really good, maybe even extraordinarily good amount of income off of 4,000 acres. My experience is that that's maybe enough for one and a half families.
Yeah, so it didn't happen overnight, as I had mentioned. My father-in-law and his wife Bev, my mother-in-law, started these practices back in the late 80s. And one of the things that they originally implemented was, how do we use the cattle as a tool to improve the land so that the land will then produce more? And that was the learnings from Alan Savory, was to use tools differently. So animals and living organisms can be tools to improve soil health. So just based on what used to be called rotational grazing practices, which are now called adaptive management or planned grazing, because rotational doesn't quite cover it anymore. Through that practice of allowing the animals to graze at high stock density and then move away from and allow the land to rest adequately, depending on where you are in the world, to rest adequately to fully recover, allows that whole biological process to happen and improves the conditions for microorganisms. And when you have more microorganisms active, they do their job better and create soil aggregates and just conditions that allow more vegetation to grow. So when you subscribe to that process and you practice that, your land gets healthier. You can grow more forage on the same land base or even less land and increase dollars per acre. So over the course from the late 80s until now, we've been constantly embedded in that practice, which allows us to make more dollars per acre than conventional, cattle ranching. So we can have more than one family. Our general rule of thumb is that it takes about 300 cows to support one family. But if you manage holistically and you use the regenerative ag practices of covering the bare ground and, allowing the water to soak in and not run off and all the practices, which we can get into later, when you do that, then you can actually increase your profitability, which will allow more people to sustain themselves on the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you were mentioning cattle prices this year have been extraordinarily high, but that's not to say that you're doing this because of these high prices, because you've been at this for quite a while. But even if you lost that, do you feel like having these practices in place gives you the resilience to ride out highs and lows? Like you're not depending on these high prices to have three families on your ranch.
That's correct. So, just to give you some idea, when we moved back in 2002, so my husband and I left Montana and we began um, managing and living on the ranch currently with three families, with young children and, full blown families here. And that was the year. So 2002 and 2003 was sort of this, left and right hook. It was BSE, borders closing, and extreme drought in much of Western Canada. And so, it is because of our practice that we were able to survive where, cull cows were selling for 10 cents a pound if you were lucky. That it was pretty rough. Um, that is kind of living proof that when you stay in the practice of holistic management, you're making better decisions. You're looking at gross profits. You're understanding, what a unit of what you produce returns back to your overheads. It helps you analyze what your margins are so that you can make decisions that are going to impact you financially. It impacts, your land environmentally, and it impacts your people socially. And so, I guess that's sort of how we're able to survive those highs and lows. Now, in a high cycle like this, it's very easy to allow your costs to also rise. The price of fuel today is higher than it was in 2002 when we got here. But
Mhm.
our cattle prices right now would allow for us to just spend a lot more on producing, a cow-calf unit. But when we stay in the holistic practice, we are actually considering, what do we do in a windfall year? When you have a surplus of profitability, Do you just allow costs to rise, or are you disciplined enough to say, no, we're going to keep our costs the same, even in this high cycle? Our margins increase significantly. What are we going to do with that surplus? Can we use that and reinvest it back into a wealth generating enterprise? So that's kind of where we are in today's cycle, is saying, okay, so as cattle prices are high, how can we use that so that we are contributing to the overall future profitability for the next generation or multiple generations ahead of where we are today?
Oh, that sounds like fantastic advice. That's a whole bottle of wisdom right there in that answer.
Well, it's very similar to, when you start saving when you're 18, you acquire compound interest over many, many years. Even if it's just pennies to start off with, it eventually turns into, it's the same concept as compound interest. What is it that we can invest in today that's going to pay, down the road over a long period of time? So
Mhm.
it's the same concept applied in different ways.
Maybe this is jumping around a little bit, but um, you've talked about how you raise your cattle with the, regenerative grazing, and we can get into more detail about that. I would like to know, are you 100% grass based? Because I haven't heard you mention grain yet.
Yeah, so we do have like a tractor, and we have a loader that is specifically for being able to move bales or to move some dirt around. We try not to own very many pieces of equipment because they're super costly. So anything that rusts, rots, or depreciates, we try not to purchase much of. But we do have equipment. We do feed our animals in the winter. So the way that we feed our animals in the winter is hopefully to spend as less or the least amount of money we can on diesel fuel. So we don't want to start our equipment in -40 if we can help it. So
Mhm.
we produce cattle here. We do not produce hay. We don't produce grain. We are not in farming. But what we do is we build relationships with people in our area, hopefully very close, that are in the production of hay or other sources of forage or feed for our cattle. Most of the time, it works out when the weather cooperates and we have a good precipitation year. There is ample forage sold in our area for us to purchase and bring back onto our operation. We
Ah,
see that as an investment into our soil. So instead of spending our dollar on purchasing a tractor and a hay bine and a baler, we invest those dollars back into the community. So people who are our peers that are producing that forage. And so we keep them in business, they keep us in business. So we sort of have this win-win situation. That's how we perceive it. I don't know how they perceive it. That doesn't matter to us, but we're hopefully supporting their production.
mhm.
What we do know is that we are importing also nutrients. So we are feeding all of that to our cattle out on the land. We don't hold them in corrals. We don't like take the, piles of manure and try to distribute it. We allow the animal to do that themselves. So hopefully in a really good year, we purchase that feed. We have it delivered right out into our pastures. We cut the twines and we bale graze that all winter long. So we have right now 3 to 4 months of feed set out, for one of our main herds. And we just move them throughout the winter, take down a fence, let them move into the next pod of bales, and don't have to start the tractor very much.
Yeah, that's a practice that I've been learning about. And I actually recently got to take a farm tour where they did bale grazing, and we got to see the results of that.
Mhm.
And I mean, I've heard about this for a while, but getting to see it firsthand, I was still blown away by how you could see where the bale was and the incredible difference in the graph. It just was so amazing to see where the bale was at least double the production, probably even triple of the
Yeah,
grass where there was, that was a miss, getting covered by the bale grazing. Um,
yeah.
I have 2 questions
So
from that. I'll just
yes,
give you one of them. I'll give you both of them, and you can answer them one at a time or in whichever order you like. So my first question is, um, with the bale grazing, my impression is that the soil is hungry for that, like you say, import of nutrients. Farmers tend to view it as wasteful, I think. People who don't do it, they don't like they see they're wasting what's left on the ground. However, it seems like the soil is hungry for that import. If you could explain that, that would be great. And then my second question is, do you find it takes longer for your cattle to gain weight because you don't have them in a feedlot setting? And how does that impact your farm?
Sure. I think I'll start with that, the weight gain, because it's a mentality that I think we've all been subject to in conventional agriculture. We are driven on a sort of a treadmill of production. So when you think about farming, it's about, bushels of grain per acre. When you think about cattle, it's about weaning weights or, you know, um, weight off of grass or weight gained in the feedlot. What is the capacity for the animal to gain weight or average daily gain? So we have all these metric for measuring production. So in isolation, what I find, I guess, dangerous about that is that it's a parochial view of what you're trying to accomplish. Best yields, best gains, without consideration to the wake that you leave behind you. So if there's a boat pushing through the water and we're going to get the highest gains possible, you're creating a wake behind you that has an impact. And unless you turn around and take a look at that, in holistic management, we call it the feedback loop. Unless you're turning around and looking at the recovery of what is happening behind you, you lose sight of. And so you talked about hungry soil. So if you focus on production for a very long period of time, you're mining all of the nutrients out of the soil and you're leaving it wanton. There isn't anything that's going back into it. So in holistic practice, we take production seriously because we need profitability to keep going, but we don't do it at the cost of losing things in the soil. In fact, we are practicing to actually regenerate the soil to put the nutrients back in. And there's a way to do that if you understand that symbiotic cycle between the animals grazing and the nutrients below the subsurface. And so when you go back to this bale grazing concept, first of all, I'd like to say I fully subscribe that there is no waste in nature. Now, that's a paradigm shift, and that can be difficult for some people to really absorb because they see something laid on the land that is not doing what they thought it would do. Therefore, they think it's either a mistake, a failure, or wasteful. Nature doesn't waste anything. If you're very observant, you'll see that right now leaves are falling off of the tree. Is that a waste? Well, no, they're going back down onto the soil surface. They eventually will be, break down, become detritus, become, this, loamy soil that has nutrient density, and something else is going to grow, perhaps a new tree, perhaps grass. So, when you think about that cycle, when we put bales out on the land and the animals, the harvesters, quote unquote, digest that through multiple stomachs and it comes out the back end in the form of fertilizer. So you've got that whole process going along with their saliva and their dander and everything else that's going on in a living organism ends up on the land with some what we call biological capital or litter or soil armor. There's something laying on the surface of the soil. If you're feeding like a green feed, for example, there's a lot of straw or stems from the oat plants that are, laying on the ground. What that is doing is actually creating a hospitable environment for microorganisms. So that quote unquote waste that is laying on the subsurface is actually improving the water cycle. So more water will be retained there, especially during dry seasons. That's super helpful. There's going to be more successional species growing. So it creates an environment where things can grow now that they couldn't grow before. There's going to be the breakdown of that material, so there's more nutrients available. So the mineral cycle is actually more effective. when things begin to grow, and sometimes they look like undesirable species, like maybe dandelion are growing first, or even some thistle or nettle, most people say like, well, that's undesirable. How do we address that problem? Those are indicator species that things are beginning to happen below that biological capital. So you get plants like dandelions that begin to grow, but if you look at that dandelion, it is, it's next level. So it's a dandelion that might grow 18 inches tall. Its leaves might be 3 or 4 inches wide because it has all the nutrients it needs to be its best, living its best life. Dandelion is a successional species. So where you might previously look at that and say, well, look at all that waste and look at all those weeds. If you have a paradigm shift and you begin to think about what's actually going on there. I've improved my water cycle. I've improved my mineral cycle. There's plants growing there that have 4-inch leaves. That's a great solar panel to capture the energy flow or the solar energy and convert it back down into the ground. So there's all kinds of things happening there. We call them ecosystem processes that are improving. So just by that very nature, you are helping regeneratively build that soil back up. And when you do that, then you've got this whole process of there's more forage, more pounds of beef per acre, more dollars coming in to support the families who live there. You can't help but improve that cycle. And it's sort of an upward spiral, right? Once you make one decision to do something and it, returns more profit, then all of a sudden you have more profit available. So you might purchase more cows, or you might, purchase more feed, there's just a lot more opportunity in that process.
Oh my goodness, that was so interesting. I have to say, I wrote down a note about your dandelion comment there, calling it next level and sounding so excited about a plant that most farmers are not excited about. And I thought to myself, I'm like, it's just so fascinating to me because when I first learned farming, back in Alberta, I learned it conventionally. And so this mindset shift of looking at weeds from the perspective of it's next level is just so fascinating to me. It is so night and day difference from what I was taught about how farming is conventionally. Yeah, it's just fascinating. Your answer reminds me of, I wanted to ask you a question about something that Don wrote, and this would probably be great for asking him too, but it's an interesting story that he wrote about with that he says his son Scott. So I guess that's probably your brother-in-law.
That's right.
Yeah, so I'll just read you, it's just one paragraph and it very ties into this. He says, our son Scott worked in southern Alberta near Elkwater Park. He was on a small ranch about 10 quarters. Rainfall had been good, about 5 inches, which is not a lot of water. When you think about it, but for that area, it's good. He says the ranch was using planned grazing principles from holistic management. Alberta agriculture was probing for moisture as part of their forage insurance. The technician got 30 inches of moisture and seemed quite impressed. Scott asked why he was impressed, as rainfall had been good. There was no hesitation as the technician replied, quote, "Oh, there isn't nearly this much moisture across the fence where they continuously graze." So there's just this black and white sort of picture where it's showing the result of this is what conventional does and this is what regenerative grazing does. Can you expand more about your experiences with those types of dynamics?
Yeah, in fact, I think the question we should, if I may, the question we should be asking is why aren't more people making changes? If in fact we have, a probe, a scientific instrument that can say, actually, you have more moisture on this side and you have less moisture on this side, except you both got the same rain cloud. So what's happening there? And what we're talking about is, the water cycle, whether it's healthy or unhealthy. We're talking about the water cycle, and we're talking about improving the effectiveness of the rain that does fall. We don't have control over how much falls, but we certainly have some influence over how well we hold on to it, whether it, absorbs into the soil or runs off sideways or evaporates. We're working towards transpiration. So the process of the water going into the soil, into the plant, and then coming out of the leaves. It's sort of grade 5 science that we're talking about. But that process, we can see the difference based on our, planned grazing, our adaptive management. We see the results. The people who are reading the articles and attending the field days and reading the textbooks and watching the YouTube videos, they are all seeing the exact same thing that we are. So what's the difference? And if you talk to Blaine Jurtis, a colleague of mine, he often talks about, we're trying to work on compaction in the soil, but what we need to do is work on compaction between the ears, that there's a paradigm shift that must happen for people to say, oh, wait a minute. So how does this impact me, and what decisions can I make to get more of this happening? For whatever reason, people get stuck, and likely due to fear that, if I try something new, I might fail. But there's a shift. There's a bit of courage required to say, I'm going to try something new. So when we talk about effective, water cycle in a pasture on this side of the fence versus that side of the fence, it really has nothing to do with the moisture probe. It has nothing to do with, who is looking at it. It has everything to do with, am I willing to think differently about what's going on? That's the question we should be asking.
Oh, I love that. That's exactly what I've been wanting to ask, but somehow it seems like I don't want to insult farmers and say, wow, look at the difference you can make. How come you're not doing it?
Mm-hmm.
It's just
Mm-hmm.
what we thought, I suppose.
Yes. And so, paradigms are built over time, and they are intergenerational. So if we are to, and this goes into sort of change management, if we admit that there is a different way of doing something, then what it feels like we need to admit is that what we have been doing was wrong.
Mm.
And that is a hard pill to swallow, especially when it's embedded in, generations, which says if I go out and do something differently, like plant peas and oats together, or start putting turnips and sunflowers and things in the field that traditionally has grown canola and wheat, then what I'm saying is an insult to my grandfather and his father and all the generations before.
Mm.
Now, I don't believe that's true. I believe that's the evolution of knowledge and wisdom being passed from generation to generation. But if you are in it and you make a decision, you might think that it will insult your father or your grandfather. Now, the difference between actually evolving into a different thought process and insulting a previous generation is communication. So if a young budding farmer wants to try something new, but they don't because they're afraid of insulting somebody, a conversation around saying, I respect what you've done. I'm going to try something new. How do you feel about that? That could end up in a bit of a conflict for sure. But chances are the generation before wants the new generation to actually do well. So they might say, go for it. But those conversations rarely happen.
Mm.
And, that's where, my work is sort of in the field of agriculture is in helping bridge the gap between generations to have courageous conversations so that we're not assuming things, that we can have that conversation and say, when I plant turnips, I see a difference. And that sort of communication needs to be facilitated sometimes. And so that's kind of what I do in my consulting business, is help people have those conversations and make sure they're aligned with what they want.
Oh, I love that. That is fantastic. I also feel like it brings the question to mind for me, that being one of the challenges. Do you think that another challenge that maybe sometimes impedes these conversations or this direction moving towards regenerative farming, do you think that farmers just hear these stories and say, well, that sounds too good to be true? Like it's just made up maybe or exaggerated?
Mm. Yeah, well, that's certainly safer to believe, isn't it? And so for anybody who's listening to your podcast, we're probably not, addressing this to, we're kind of preaching to the choir, right? Somebody who's going to listen to a regenerative podcast is probably like already sort of shifting their mindset or their thoughts. But what I'm really more concerned about is that people need to be ready for change.
Mm,
I could go to somebody and say, you need to change, and it's probably not going to be very effective.
hmm
So it comes from within. So somebody needs to have a bit of a revelation themselves to say, okay, there's got to be something else. And if there's just a small spark of that, they will look for opportunities to find more information about that. If that spark is not there, it is almost impossible to sort of breach that paradigm.
mm,
And so, what we're on the verge of right now, I believe, is the tipping point. The word regenerative or the word holistic is more commonly known now than it was, 25 years ago when I first started learning about it. In fact, it was kind of perceived as cultish or, yeah, too good to be true, or, fish stories.
mm.
How could you possibly get 7 times more grazing after doing some bale grazing over the winter? How is that possible? Right? Well,
Yeah.
let me show let me show you. Let me take you out and see the dark circle where the bale stood. And, we can measure where the bale wasn't and where the bale is. How much forage is there now? Well, there's 7 times the amount of forage. We can't argue with that. But even with that evidence or proof, it's still, if somebody is not ready for change, they'll say, well, that won't work in, I don't know, Cutbank. That won't work in Lethbridge. So they'll be able to make some sort of excuse
Mm.
that it's not going to work. And to me, that just shows me that that person is not quite ready. We don't do like a prescriptive, advice column here at BBARC. We don't say, here's what you need to do.
hmm
The people must arrive at the shift in order for us to have for me to have a conversation as a consultant. They have to want to explore into something else. Something doesn't work currently. So they can admit that, whether it's their finances, whether it's, they're having to use more and more inputs on their field. Often people come to me when their marriage starts falling apart. I'm not a marriage counselor. I'm not a therapist at all or a social worker, but communication is breaking down. It doesn't matter whether it's your profitability, your soil fertility, or your marriage. If there's an issue, that's the entry point for people to say, we need to change something. And that's when I feel like the door is open and they will see the bale grazing effects. They will see the profitability margins and they will see a way through, their communication issues.
Oh, that is fantastic. Yes. So really it comes down to, like you said, the compaction between the ears. One thing that every farmer who ever does regenerative farming practices, the first thing that they ever change is how they think about their farm. Is that accurate to say?
Yes. And how they think about their people and how they think about, it's like one of the strongest paradigms I come up with is that there is no profitability in agriculture. We do it for the lifestyle. Or, I do it because I was told from a young age, this someday will be yours. um, and, those aren't legitimate enough reasons to actually spend your entire life doing. So people need to sort of arrive at, I want to do this. I want to engage. I want to make a difference. I want my soil to be healthier. I want the food that I produce to be healthier for my family and healthier for the people, living in the cities that purchase my products. There's some sort of value-based reason there. And when you can tap into that, that's where the magic happens, right? That's where people are like, if that's important to me, then I'm going to make this decision. And it gets them closer to what they want as opposed to farther away. That's where I think where our focus is.
Okay, this conversation has been fantastic. I have been thoroughly enjoying everything that you've been talking about and your answers to all of my questions. I have one more question for you that we'll kind of use as a wrap up. Let's pretend that I'm a farmer. I have a farm of, say, maybe 1,500, 2,000 acres, mixed grain and cattle, and it's been farmed conventionally by generations before me. But I'm coming onto the farm and I see that I want things to change. I haven't done anything yet. What's your advice to me, as like, what would be my first thing I should do?
So, thankfully, this is sort of my professional life as a consultant. I do help people sort of step into what it is that they are curious about. And my first go-to with an individual or a family or a corporation is to get really clear on what your values are. So there's a goal setting portion that requires some introspection and hopefully some collaborative work with whoever you are working with. So if it's your spouse, whether they're involved or not, or your extended family, or if it's intergenerational, as you mentioned, bringing in the wisdom and experience from the previous generation and getting clear on what the values are for that operation. And they can be embedded in legacy, right? It is passed down from one generation to the next. There's definitely going to be some historical value there. So getting clear on the values and then what it is that you envision. So if you suspect changes need to happen, what is it that you're changing towards? So I often prompt people to think about 3 to 7 generations from now, what do you want this place to look like? What does your community look like? That way we can begin to test the actions or decisions that you make today to ensure that they're getting you towards that future vision. And then sort of asking the questions, okay, if that's where you want to end up in 50 to 300 years, what are you going to do today? So what is the behavior? What is the process or system that you need to put into place? So is it regenerative farming practices? Is it planned grazing practice? Is it, some financial planning that will ensure your profitability over the long run? So that's sort of the goal setting process that I would recommend to people. And then I would work with them on creating an annual financial plan and budget and creating either a grazing or a cropping plan so that they feel like when I walk away as a consultant, they have things that they can do and learn more about so that there's actually some tangible things, boots on the ground, that they can be doing towards implementing big changes. The most successful people that I've seen in making change is those that create a community of support around them. So I work in communities and, teach 6-day courses, but really what I'm doing, other than passing down like some tools, financial planning or grazing planning tools, is creating a community of practice. So helping people with a peer learning network. So when they come up against convention and say, or convention that says to them, this is scary, this is wrong, that'll never work, is they have people around them to say, no, let's dabble in it a little bit more. Let's try something new. And you've got this peer support that will help you sort of stay in alignment with what you want. That community, in my opinion, is growing. So I can, as you've discovered, when you start looking, if you buy a blue Subaru, then you see a whole bunch of blue Subarus around. When you start dabbling in the practice, you begin to see like, holy cow, there's a lot of people who are farming regeneratively, who are thinking differently, who, are embedded in the holistic practice. And so I think there's a very large community of people who are on the cusp of change or have been, changing like our family for decades already. What I'm really curious about is, do people know here in Canada that there is a whole world of people that are embedded in this practice? So Alan Savory started this way back in, the 70s, where, he started forming these ideas, and they were not all original ideas. He was learning from, people before him that had some of the same concepts. And so what we're talking about is, a massive shift of wisdom and experience from one generation to the next. What I suspect is, if we can get enough people, especially who are not involved in agriculture, thinking about their decision making, towards taking actions towards what they value, we would not be in sort of this political unrest that we are globally today. And I have a colleague of mine who has decided this is the way to go. And he is running for leadership in a political party to sort of change the face of how Canadian politics are run in this country. And I think that's where this regenerative agriculture, this holistic management practice will take us, is value-based, effective decision making.
What sort of action could consumers take to help farmers and all of our society move towards this regenerative direction, or just a better direction?
Yeah, I think it comes with reflection. So reflective practice, uh, you know, what's the food that I'm eating? Where does it come from? How is it produced? That is, as a consumer, is kind of a good place to start. Uh, but I also think it is taking ownership of your part in the world. It's about saying, well, actually, I do matter. What my decisions matter. What vehicles I choose to drive, the occupation that I choose to have, all of those actually make a difference. So reflecting on it and then actually feeling a part of something bigger, because when people feel a part of something, they're more likely to say, well, you know what? I get my cabbage from, a community supported agricultural site just outside of the city. I develop relationships with the farmers. I actually harvest the things myself and I bring it home and I make that coleslaw for Thanksgiving supper. And we all feel a part of that cycle. And that's where I think there's a huge disconnect between the producers and the consumers of how we feel our bodies. And, I don't think you want to get me started on, our global health epidemic and, have the foods that we produce. But I do believe that that is part of this larger picture that we need to be making decisions, effective decisions towards what we want. So if we want to be healthier, if we want to have less obesity, diabetes, all those things, we need to be making effective decisions. So anybody who is not embedded in agriculture can certainly make effective decisions towards things that they value.
Oh, I love that. We are all part of this. If you're a farmer, you're working directly with the soil. But even if you're not a farmer, you still matter and you still have an impact. That was one of the very first things I said on this podcast was, it doesn't matter if you're a farmer or not a farmer. You matter because we are
Mhm.
all part of this. I absolutely love that. I feel like that's a great place for us to leave off today. I would absolutely love to interview you more in the future. I feel like you're just a wealth of knowledge, and I am so grateful for the time you took today to talk with me, Bluesette. Really, really appreciate you. Uh, if people would like to get a hold of you, get in touch with you, or just find out more about what you do, why don't you just leave some information about how people can get in touch with you, and we'll leave it at that.
Sure. Yeah. You can find me on Facebook, Bluesette Campbell. You can check out our website. We're the B Bar C, so it's B-C Ranch. Um, and you can always reach out to my email address, bluesettecampbell@gmail.com, or my cell phone, 306-240-8044.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
A quick reminder of upcoming events. The Manitoba Forage and Grassland Association's Regenerative Agriculture Conference is happening on November 12th and 13th in Brandon, Manitoba. The theme this year is Enriching Land, Lives, and Livelihoods. This conference will feature an incredible lineup of keynote speakers. I'll be in attendance at the conference this year, and I am excited to get the opportunity to meet and connect with like-minded people who are as passionate about regenerative farming as I am. And you can bet I'll be posting all about the event here on my podcast in the weeks following. Next year, Holistic Management Canada is hosting its annual conference on February 6th through 8th in Taber, Alberta. I'm excited to go to that one as well, especially after having interviewed Kelly and Bluesette here on the podcast. Events like these conferences are an incredible way to recharge, network, and bring fresh ideas back to your farm. There are also other smaller events, both online and in person, happening in between, and you can find information about those on the Regenerative Farming News media pages, where I keep updated posts about upcoming regenerative events. Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode of Regenerative Farming News. I'm still kind of bumbling along with this podcast, and I am by far not the world's greatest podcast maker. But if you've listened to this entire episode, just know that I am grateful for you, and I appreciate everyone who takes the time to listen and learn. Hit me up on Facebook or Instagram and help me make this show better. This is Heather Heinrichs signing off. Together, we can grow healthier soil, stronger farms, and a more resilient future.